I'm standing in the back corner of the Rosewood Country Club ballroom, watching my sister Natalie glide across the marble floor in her $8,000 wedding dress, the same dress I helped pay for with 3 months of overtime shifts at the children's hospital. She doesn't know I covered the catering deposit when Dad's business went under last winter. She doesn't know I've been sending money home for her wedding expenses while living off ramen noodles in my studio apartment. She doesn't even know what I actually do for work. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. When Natalie's eyes find me across the crowded reception, her perfectly contoured face twists into that familiar expression of disdain I've seen since we were children. Even in my simple navy dress, the nicest thing I own that isn't scrubs, I can see her calculating how I might embarrass her on her perfect day. The reception is everything Natalie dreamed of. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over 200 guests seated at tables draped in blush silk. White roses cascade from towering centerpieces, and a string quartet plays softly near the dance floor where couples sway to classical music. This is Fairhaven's event of the year, attended by the town's most prominent families, business owners, and politicians. Everyone who matters in our small Connecticut coastal town is here to witness Natalie Morrison marry Captain Jake Rodriguez, a decorated Marine officer home from his 3rd deployment. I'm relegated to table 12, tucked behind a pillar where wedding photographers won't accidentally capture me in their shots. Mom's careful planning, no doubt. Can't have the family disappointment visible in the professional photos that will grace Natalie's perfectly curated Instagram feed for years to come. As I sip champagne I can't afford and watch my sister bask in the attention she's always craved, I think about how we got here. 26 years of being the responsible older sister, the one who cleaned up messes while Natalie created them. The one who worked double shifts to send money home while Natalie planned her dream wedding. The one who graduated summa cum laude from nursing school while Natalie dropped out of college twice to find herself. The guests at my table, distant cousins and family friends who stopped asking about my life years ago, make polite conversation about the weather and the beautiful ceremony. They introduce me to their companions as Natalie's older sister, the nurse, with that slight pause that makes it clear they think nursing is a nice little job for women who can't do anything important. What they don't know is that I'm not just any nurse. I'm a pediatric trauma specialist at Hartford Children's Hospital, one of only 12 nurses in Connecticut certified in advanced pediatric life support and emergency surgical assistance. Last Tuesday, I spent 14 hours straight helping save a 6-year-old who'd been hit by a drunk driver, manually ventilating him when our equipment failed, refusing to leave his side until his parents could get there from Boston. But tonight, I'm just Rachel, the forgettable older sister who never married, never had kids, never did anything worth celebrating. The MC announces that the bride wants to say a few words, and Natalie takes the microphone with practiced grace. She thanks her parents for their endless support, her bridesmaids for their loyalty, and Jake's family for welcoming her with open arms. The crowd murmurs appreciatively as she speaks about love and new beginnings and dreams coming true. Then her gaze finds me again, and something shifts in her expression. Maybe it's the champagne, maybe it's the adrenaline of being the center of attention, or maybe it's just 26 years of resentment finally finding its voice. But I see the exact moment she decides to take her shot. And of course, Natalie continues, her voice taking on that sweet, poisonous tone I remember from childhood. I have to thank my big sister Rachel for being here tonight. She's so busy with her very important job at the hospital. She pauses for effect, letting the words hang in the air while guests turn to look at me. I feel heat rise in my cheeks, knowing what's coming but powerless to stop it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For those who don't know, Rachel is a nurse, she announces with exaggerated pride, like she's introducing a child who just learned to tie their shoes. She takes temperatures and gives people band-aids. Very heroic work. The laughter that follows hits me like a physical blow. 200 people chuckling at my expense, reducing years of education, training, and life-saving work to a joke about thermometers and adhesive bandages. I see colleagues from the hospital scattered throughout the room, Dr. Patterson from pediatric surgery, nurse manager Williams, even chief of staff Dr. Chen, all looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. My hands shake as I set down my champagne glass. I could sit here and take it, the way I've taken every dismissal, every slight, every moment of being made small so Natalie could shine brighter. I could smile and nod and let everyone think I'm exactly what she says I am, a glorified babysitter with a nursing degree. Or I could tell them the truth. Actually, I say, standing slowly, my voice carrying in the suddenly quiet ballroom, I'm a pediatric trauma specialist. I work in the emergency department, treating critically injured children. The laughter dies in scattered patches, but Natalie isn't finished. She rolls her eyes dramatically, playing to her audience with the theatrical flair that's always made her the center of attention. Oh please, Rachel. Everyone knows you just wanted to feel important, so you gave yourself a fancy title. You're still just changing bedpans and taking orders from real doctors. That's when I see him, Captain Jake Rodriguez, Natalie's new husband, standing at the head table in his dress blue uniform. Throughout Natalie's speech, he'd been smiling proudly at his bride. But when she started mocking my work, something changed in his expression. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched, and his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made the air feel thin. Now, as Natalie delivers her final insult about taking orders from real doctors, Jake's face goes completely white. He stares at me like he's seeing a ghost, and I watch recognition dawn in his eyes. Then he does something that makes the entire reception freeze. He stands up, walks directly to Natalie, and in front of 200 stunned guests, he speaks 4 words that will destroy everything. Apologize to her. Now. Because Captain Jake Rodriguez knows exactly who I am. He knows about the night 3 years ago when his unit was pinned down in Syria, when the medevac helicopter couldn't land due to heavy fire, when a pediatric trauma specialist volunteered for the most dangerous medical mission in Marine Corps history. He knows about the woman who crawled through a minefield to reach wounded Marines, who performed emergency surgery in a bombed-out building while mortars fell around them. He knows that the nurse who takes temperatures, standing in the back of his wedding reception, is the same woman who saved his best friend's life, and 17 other Marines, in what military historians would later call the miracle of Aleppo. This is the story of how my sister's perfect wedding became the day her entire world collapsed, and how the man she married chose honor over her without saying a single word. Stay with me, because what happens next will destroy everything. My name is Rachel Morrison, and I've been invisible my entire life. Not literally, of course, but in all the ways that matter to a family that measures worth by how much attention you can command and how little trouble you cause. I learned early that in the Morrison household, there were 2 types of children, the star and the support system. Natalie was born to be the star, blonde, beautiful, naturally charming with that effortless grace that made adults melt and teachers forgive her when she forgot homework or showed up late to class. She had what my mother called that special something, an indefinable quality that drew people to her like moths to a flame. I was born to be the support system. The pattern established itself when I was 7 and Natalie was 4. I remember the exact moment with crystalline clarity because it was the first time I understood my place in our family's ecosystem. Natalie had thrown a spectacular tantrum in the middle of Cromwell's department store because Mom wouldn't buy her a sparkly dress that cost more than our weekly grocery budget. While Natalie screamed and threw herself on the floor, drawing stares from every shopper in the children's section, I quietly picked up the items she'd knocked off the display rack and helped Mom gather our scattered belongings. What a helpful little girl, the store clerk said to my mother, smiling at me with genuine warmth. You must be so proud of her. My mother glanced at me briefly, then knelt down to comfort Natalie, who was still sobbing dramatically. Oh, Rachel's always been the responsible one, she said dismissively, as if responsibility were some unfortunate genetic defect I'd been born with. Natalie's just more spirited. That's when I learned that being good, being helpful, being responsible wasn't something that earned praise, it was simply expected. While Natalie's smallest accomplishments were celebrated with photo albums and phone calls to grandparents, my achievements were filed away as just what Rachel does. When I brought home straight A's, it was because I was naturally academic. When Natalie managed a B+, it was because she'd really applied herself and deserved a celebration dinner at her favorite restaurant. The disparity became more pronounced as we grew older. At 10, I was making breakfast for both of us before school because Mom had started working early shifts at the real estate office to help Dad's struggling accounting firm. While other kids my age were playing after school, I was helping Natalie with homework she'd forgotten about, braiding her hair for dance recitals, and making sure she had clean clothes for the next day. I didn't mind, or at least I told myself I didn't mind. Natalie needed me, and being needed felt like a form of love, even if it wasn't the kind of love she received. When she cried because other kids teased her about her lisp, I spent hours helping her practice pronunciation. When she was terrified of the dark, I let her sleep in my room for 2 years straight, giving up my privacy so she could feel safe. Our parents' marriage was another complication that fell largely on my shoulders to manage. Dad's accounting business barely stayed afloat during the best of times, and Mom's real estate career was feast or famine depending on the market. Financial stress created a constant undercurrent of tension that erupted into full-blown arguments at least twice a week. When they fought, Natalie would run to her room crying, slamming the door and refusing to come out until someone coaxed her with promises and apologies. I became the family mediator, the one who stayed downstairs to clean up whatever had been thrown, to make tea for Mom while she cried about the bills, to listen to Dad's frustrations about clients who didn't pay on time and overhead costs that kept climbing. "You're so mature for your age, Rachel," Mom would tell me during these late-night crisis management sessions. "I don't know what we'd do without you." It felt like praise at the time, but looking back, I realize it was really an abdication of parental responsibility. They were proud of my maturity because it meant they didn't have to parent me. They could focus all their emotional energy on Natalie, who needed constant reassurance, constant attention, constant management, while I took care of myself and often took care of them too. High school crystallized the pattern even further. While I maintained a 4.0 GPA, worked part-time at the local pharmacy, and volunteered at Fairhaven General Hospital's pediatric ward, Natalie struggled with classes she found boring and cycled through interests like seasonal fashion trends. She tried cheerleading, quit after 2 weeks. Joined the drama club, quit during the first rehearsal when she didn't get the lead. Started a school newspaper, abandoned it when she realized it required actual work. Each failed attempt was met with understanding and encouragement from our parents. Natalie's still finding her passion, they'd explain to relatives who asked about her constantly changing activities. "She has so many talents, it's hard for her to choose." Meanwhile, when I was accepted into a competitive summer program for pre-med students at Yale, the response was lukewarm congratulations followed immediately by concern about how Natalie would manage without me around to help her stay organized. The summer I turned 17, I watched Natalie fail her driving test 3 times while I aced mine on the first try. Each of her failures resulted in comfort shopping trips and spa days to boost her self-esteem. My success was acknowledged with a brief, "Good job, honey," before the conversation turned to strategies for helping Natalie overcome her test anxiety. That's when I started to understand that my role in this family wasn't really about being loved, it was about making everyone else's life easier. I was the one who remembered birthdays and bought gifts when our parents were too busy. I was the one who covered for Natalie when she snuck out to parties, creating alibis and taking the blame when she inevitably got caught. I was the one who worked extra hours at the pharmacy to help pay for her SAT prep course when she decided she wanted to go to college after all. The worst part wasn't the inequality, it was the way it was treated as natural, inevitable, even admirable. "Rachel's always been so independent," became the family mantra, as if independence were something I'd chosen rather than something that had been thrust upon me by neglect disguised as trust in my maturity. By the time I graduated valedictorian, achievement that earned a brief mention at the dinner table before conversation shifted to Natalie's prom dress drama, I had learned to find my worth outside the family system. I discovered that at the hospital, my careful attention to detail and natural empathy weren't just expected baseline behavior, they were valued skills that could save lives. That's why I chose nursing, and specifically pediatric nursing. Working with sick children, I found a place where being responsible, being caring, being the person who stayed calm in crisis situations, wasn't just tolerated, it was essential. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who saw my skills as extraordinary rather than ordinary. But even as I built a career I loved, even as I specialized in trauma medicine and earned certifications that made me one of the most qualified pediatric nurses in the state, my family continued to see me through the same lens they'd been using since I was 7 years old. Rachel the responsible one. Rachel the helper. Rachel who doesn't need attention because she's so good at taking care of herself. When I told them I was planning to volunteer for a medical mission overseas, a decision that would eventually lead me to Syria and change everything, their response was predictable. Mom worried about how dangerous it sounded. Dad worried about the cost and whether my job would hold my position. And Natalie worried about who would help her plan her engagement party while I was gone. None of them asked why I wanted to go, what I hoped to accomplish, or whether I was scared. Because in 24 years, it had never occurred to them that I might have needs, fears, or dreams that had nothing to do with supporting everyone else. I was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous missions aren't the ones you volunteer for overseas. Sometimes they're the ones waiting for you in your own family, disguised as love. 3 months before Natalie's wedding, I received a call that would change everything. I was finishing my shift in the pediatric ICU, checking on Tommy Chen, a 7-year-old who'd survived a house fire thanks to quick thinking from his babysitter, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. "Is this Rachel Morrison?" The voice was deep, careful, with the kind of controlled tone that immediately identified military training. "Speaking." "Who is this?" "This is Captain Jake Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps. I'm going to be marrying your sister Natalie in a few months." I paused in the middle of updating Tommy's chart. Natalie had mentioned her fiancé was military, but she'd been vague about details. She preferred to focus on the romantic aspects of their relationship, how they'd met at a charity gala, how he'd swept her off her feet, how handsome he looked in uniform, rather than discussing his actual service. "Congratulations," I said, genuinely meaning it. "Natalie's over the moon about the wedding." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Ms. Morrison, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you ever been to Syria?" The question hit me like a physical blow. My hand gripped the phone tighter, and I looked around the ICU to make sure no one could overhear. "Why are you asking me that?" "Please. Just answer the question." "Yes," I said quietly. "I was there on a medical mission 3 years ago." "Why?" Another pause, longer this time. When Jake spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I need to see you. In person. Before the wedding. There's something I need to tell you, and I can't do it over the phone." We met 2 days later at a small coffee shop in Hartford, far enough from Fairhaven that we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. Jake arrived in civilian clothes, jeans and a polo shirt, but even without the uniform, his military bearing was unmistakable. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of alert posture that comes from years of training and deployment. But what struck me most were his eyes, dark brown, intense, carrying the weight of someone who'd seen things he wished he could forget. He'd ordered coffee for both of us and was sitting at a corner table when I arrived. As I approached, he stood immediately, extending his hand with formal politeness. "Ms. Morrison. Thank you for meeting me." "Rachel, please," I said, settling into the chair across from him. "And you can probably drop the formality. We're going to be family soon." Jake's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. That's actually what I need to talk to you about." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather journal, worn and stained, with pages that looked like they'd been read countless times. "This belonged to my best friend, Sergeant Danny Vasquez. He was my roommate at Quantico, the best man at my first wedding, godfather to my daughter." "Was?" I asked gently. "Kia 2 years ago in Afghanistan. IED. Jake's voice remained steady, but I could see the pain in his eyes. "But before he died, he gave me this journal. Said there was something in it I needed to read, something about Syria." He opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon and turned it toward me. The handwriting was careful, precise, the kind of penmanship they teach in military schools. March 15, 2021. Day 6 in hell. We're trapped in what used to be a school building outside Aleppo. Martinez has shrapnel in his chest, Thompson's leg is mangled, and Collins hasn't woken up since the mortar round hit. We've been calling for medevac for 18 hours, but the LZ is too hot. Command says they can't risk it. I read the words with growing dread, memories flooding back of those terrible days when everything went wrong, when a routine medical support mission turned into the longest week of my life. Then this morning, something incredible happened. A voice came over the radio, calm, professional, American. A woman. She said she was a civilian medical volunteer, that she'd heard our situation and was coming to help. Rodriguez, that's me, I told her it was suicide. The building is surrounded, mortars falling every 10 minutes, snipers on every rooftop. No one could get to us. My hands trembled as I continued reading Danny's account of that day, seeing it through the eyes of the Marines I'd risked everything to reach. But she came anyway. I don't know how she did it. She crawled through a minefield that had already killed 2 Syrian fighters, then somehow made it past 3 sniper nests. By the time she reached us, she was covered in dust and blood from cuts she'd gotten crawling under razor wire. But she was calm. Completely, impossibly calm. Jake leaned forward, his eyes never leaving my face. Keep reading. She worked on us for 6 hours straight. No sleep, barely any water, mortars shaking the building every few minutes. When Martinez went into cardiac arrest, she performed CPR for 45 minutes until she got him back. When Thompson started bleeding out, she used her own clothing to make pressure bandages. And when Collins wouldn't wake up, she somehow rigged a ventilator from spare equipment and kept him breathing manually. I closed my eyes, remembering the weight of Collins' head in my hands, the rhythm of squeezing the makeshift ventilator bag every 3 seconds for hours until my arms screamed with fatigue. Remembering Martinez's face going blue, the desperate compressions on his chest, the moment his heart finally started beating again. Remembering Thompson's scared eyes as I worked to stop the bleeding, whispering reassurances I wasn't sure I believed myself. The extraction finally came the next morning. I continued reading. Special ops team fought their way to us, but it took 12 hours to get us all out safely. The whole time, she never left us. Never stopped working. When we finally reached the field hospital, she collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. I never got her name. Never got to thank her properly. But I'll never forget what she did. Jake's voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. Danny wrote 17 pages about those 6 days. About how you saved his life and the lives of 4 other Marines. About how you risked everything for people you'd never met, in a country that wasn't even your own. He flipped to another marked page. This is the last entry he wrote before he died. If anything happens to me, I need Jake to know about the angel in Aleppo. I need him to find her and tell her that because of what she did, I got to see my daughter take her first steps. I got to dance with my wife one more time. I got to call my mother and tell her I loved her. Find the nurse with no name and tell her that she didn't just save our lives, she gave us the chance to live them. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I couldn't look away from Danny's words. He tried to find you for 2 years, Jake continued. Contacted every medical organization, every volunteer group, every hospital that had sent personnel to Syria. But you'd somehow managed to stay completely under the radar. No news interviews, no recognition, no official commendation. It was like you'd vanished. I wiped my eyes, trying to compose myself. I didn't want recognition. That's not why I went. I know, Jake said simply. That's what made Danny so determined to find you. He said anyone who would do what you did and then disappear without claiming credit was someone worth finding. He reached across the table and gently took my hand. When Danny died, I promised him I'd continue the search. I contacted every Rachel Morrison in the medical field, every nurse who'd served overseas missions. Most of them led nowhere. Then 6 months ago, I met your sister at a charity function. My stomach dropped. You met Natalie because you were looking for me? Not exactly, Jake said carefully. I was at the gala because my unit was being honored for our service. Natalie was there representing her father's accounting firm. They were one of the sponsors. We started talking, and when she mentioned she had a sister who was a nurse, I asked casual questions. When she said you worked at Hartford Children's Hospital, that you'd done overseas volunteer work, something clicked. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. It was a group picture from the medical mission, taken during one of our rare quiet moments. I was in the background, barely visible, but Jake had circled my face in red ink. Danny had this picture. One of the Syrian doctors took it and gave copies to all the medical volunteers. Danny managed to get one before we were evacuated. It took me 3 months of comparing this grainy image to photos from your hospital's website, but I finally figured out it was you. I stared at the photo, remembering the day it was taken. We'd just successfully treated a group of children injured in a bombing, and Dr. Amir had insisted we document the moment. I'd tried to stay out of the shot, uncomfortable with being photographed during such a serious mission. So you started dating my sister to get to me? I asked, trying to keep accusation out of my voice. Jake shook his head quickly. No. God, no. I started dating your sister because she was beautiful and charming and I was lonely. When I realized who you were, I'd already been seeing Natalie for 2 months. I cared about her. I thought maybe I could have both, a relationship with her and the chance to finally thank the woman who saved my best friend's life. He ran his hands through his hair, looking exhausted. But the more time I spent with your family, the more I realized how impossible that would be. Natalie, she doesn't know who you really are. None of them do. What do you mean? I've been to a dozen family dinners, Rachel. I've heard how they talk about your work, your choices, your life. They act like you're some kind of family mascot. The responsible older sister who never quite figured out how to be important. Jake's jaw tightened with barely contained anger. Do you know what Natalie told me when I asked about your overseas work? She said you'd gone through some kind of quarter-life crisis and decided to play doctor in third-world countries because you were jealous of people with real medical degrees. The words hit me like a slap. I'd never told my family the details of what happened in Syria, partly for security reasons and partly because I knew they wouldn't understand. But hearing how Natalie had characterized the most meaningful work of my life, reducing it to jealousy and attention-seeking, was more painful than I'd expected. I've been engaged to your sister for 4 months, Jake continued, and I've been wrestling with this knowledge every single day. How do I marry someone who has so little respect for the most heroic person I've ever heard of? How do I build a life with someone who doesn't even realize her own sister is extraordinary? So why are you telling me this now? I asked. The wedding is in 3 months. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup like it might hold answers. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with a pain I recognized, the same expression I'd seen on the faces of parents whose children I couldn't save, the look of someone forced to choose between 2 impossible options. Because Danny made me promise something else, he said finally. He made me swear that if I ever found you, I'd make sure the world knew what you did. He said heroes who hide in the shadows are the ones who need recognition the most, because they're the ones who will never ask for it themselves. He leaned forward, his voice urgent now. Your family is going to continue treating you like you're invisible until someone forces them to see you. And I can't marry your sister knowing what I know and stay silent about it. Danny's been dead for 2 years, but I can still keep my promise to him. What are you planning to do? Jake's expression was grim but determined. I'm going to make sure that at least one person in your family finally sees who you really are. Even if it destroys everything else in the process. The explosion happened exactly as Jake predicted, but even he couldn't have anticipated how quickly and completely it would consume everything in its path. It started innocently enough. Jake had asked if he could bring a friend to one of our family's regular Sunday dinners, a tradition that had continued even as Natalie and I grew older, more out of habit than genuine desire to spend time together. The friend was Lieutenant Marcus Webb, another Marine from Jake's unit who was visiting from Camp Lejeune. Marcus served with me overseas, Jake had explained to my parents over Mom's famous pot roast. He's got some great stories about our time in Syria. I nearly choked on my wine. Across the table, Jake caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. This wasn't coincidence, this was orchestration. Marcus was exactly what you'd expect from a Marine officer, squared shoulders, perfect posture, the kind of man who said, "Sir," and "Ma'am" automatically and meant it. But he had an easy smile and a gift for storytelling that had my parents hanging on his every word as he shared carefully edited tales of military life. "The thing about combat zones," Marcus was saying, cutting his roast with military precision, "is that you meet the most extraordinary people in the most ordinary circumstances. Some of the bravest individuals I've ever encountered weren't soldiers at all. They were civilians who volunteered to put themselves in harm's way for complete strangers." Natalie, gorgeous in a soft pink sweater that perfectly matched her nail polish, was enjoying the attention of having two handsome Marines at her dinner table. "That sounds so dangerous," she said, touching Jake's arm possessively. "I can't imagine being brave enough to do something like that." "Well," Marcus continued, "there was this one medical volunteer in Syria. A nurse from the States who somehow ended up in one of the hottest combat zones we'd seen. Our unit was pinned down for almost a week, taking heavy casualties, and this woman—" "More potatoes, Marcus," my mother interrupted, always uncomfortable when conversation turned too serious or graphic. But Marcus pressed on, his eyes finding mine across the table. "This woman crawled through a minefield to reach us. Spent 6 days under constant fire, performing emergency surgery with improvised equipment, keeping wounded Marines alive through sheer force of will." Dad looked up from his plate with polite interest. "That's quite a story. What happened to her?" "That's the remarkable part," Jake said, taking over the narrative seamlessly. "She never sought recognition. Never gave interviews, never accepted commendations. Just disappeared back into civilian life like nothing had happened. But every Marine in that unit owes their life to her courage." "How inspiring," Mom said in the tone she used when she wanted to change subjects. "Speaking of inspiring women, did we tell you that Natalie just got promoted to assistant manager at the boutique?" It was such a perfectly timed deflection that I almost laughed. Here was a story about life or death heroism, and my mother's immediate response was to redirect attention to Natalie's retail achievement. The pattern was so ingrained, so automatic, that she probably didn't even realize she was doing it. But Marcus wasn't finished. "Actually, Mrs. Morrison, the reason I'm sharing this story is because of something incredible that happened recently. After years of searching, we finally figured out who that nurse was." The room went quiet except for the soft clink of silverware against china. Dad had stopped cutting his meat. Mom's fork was suspended halfway to her mouth. Natalie was looking between Marcus and Jake with growing confusion. "See, my buddy Danny Vasquez, he was one of the Marines she saved. He spent 2 years trying to track her down before he was killed in Afghanistan. Made me and Jake promise we'd continue the search. We had one photo, partial medical records, and the name of the hospital where she'd been volunteering." Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. "Last month, we finally put all the pieces together." He slid a photograph across the table, the same group shot Jake had shown me at the coffee shop, but this one was larger, clearer. My mother picked up the photo, squinting at it. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with?" "Mrs. Morrison," Marcus said gently, "that's your daughter in the background. That's Rachel." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the distant hum of the refrigerator, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Everyone stared at the photograph, then at me, then back at the photograph. Dad was the first to speak. "Rachel? You were in Syria?" "I told you I was doing overseas medical work," I said quietly. "You just never asked for details." "But this..." Mom's voice trailed off as she studied the image more closely. "This is a war zone." "Ma'am, with respect," Marcus said, "your daughter didn't just work in a war zone. She voluntarily entered one of the most dangerous combat situations our unit had encountered. She risked her life to save 17 Marines, working under conditions that would have broken most trained combat medics." Natalie had been unusually quiet throughout this exchange, but now she laughed, a bright, dismissive sound that cut through the tension. "Oh, come on. This is ridiculous. Rachel's a pediatric nurse. She works with sick kids, not soldiers." Jake and Marcus exchanged glances. Jake reached into his own jacket and pulled out another envelope, this one thicker. Natalie, these are official military documentation. Medical reports, after-action summaries, photographs from the field hospital. He spread the documents across the table like evidence in a courtroom. This report, he said, pointing to an official-looking document with military letterhead, details how your sister performed emergency thoracic surgery on Corporal Martinez using a field surgical kit and flashlight illumination while under active mortar fire. This one describes how she manually ventilated Private Collins for 14 hours straight when our equipment failed. And this, Marcus added, sliding forward a commendation letter, is a recommendation for the Civilian Medal of Valor that was filed by our commanding officer. It was never processed because your sister had already left the country and couldn't be located for the ceremony. The words on the page swam before my eyes. I'd never known about the medal recommendation, never imagined that what I'd done had been deemed worthy of official recognition. For 3 years, I'd carried those memories as private experiences, moments of crisis where I'd simply done what needed to be done. The idea that someone had thought my actions deserved formal acknowledgement was overwhelming. Dad picked up one of the medical reports, reading slowly. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. "Rachel, why didn't you tell us?" "I tried," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "When I came home, I tried to explain what the mission had been like. Remember? You said it sounded very stressful, and changed the subject to Natalie's engagement party planning." Mom was crying now, mascara streaming down her cheeks as she continued to stare at the photograph. "I don't understand. How could we not have known?" "Because you never asked," I said, 26 years of suppressed frustration finally breaking through. "You never asked what I did overseas, what I'd seen, whether I was okay. You just assumed it was some kind of elaborate volunteer vacation." Natalie stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is insane. You're all acting like Rachel is some kind of war hero because she happened to be in the right place at the right time. It's not like she planned to be heroic." "Natalie," Jake said, his voice carrying a warning edge I'd never heard before. But Natalie was on a roll, her face flushed with anger and something that looked like panic. "And what's with the ambush? Marcus just happens to show up with all these documents? This feels like some kind of setup to make me look bad at my own family dinner." "Nobody's trying to make you look bad," I said, standing as well. "This isn't about you." "Of course it's about me." Natalie exploded. "Everything's always about poor, overlooked Rachel and how the family doesn't appreciate her enough." "Well, maybe if you actually told us what you were doing instead of being all mysterious and martyred, we would have known." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. After years of being ignored, dismissed, and treated as secondary, I was now being blamed for not forcing my family to pay attention. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so painful. Marcus cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps I should go. I didn't mean to cause family drama." "No," Jake said firmly, his eyes never leaving Natalie's face. "You should stay. Because this conversation is long overdue." He turned to address the whole table, but his words were clearly directed at his fiancée. "For 6 months, I've been coming to these family dinners, listening to how you all talk about Rachel. Like she's some kind of well-meaning underachiever who never quite figured out how to be important. And all that time, I've known that the woman you're dismissing is one of the most courageous people I've ever heard of." Dad found his voice. "Jake, we had no idea." "That's the problem, sir. You had no idea because you never bothered to find out. Your daughter risked her life to save strangers in a foreign country, came home, and went back to work like it was just another day. And instead of being curious about her experiences, instead of asking questions or showing interest, you all just moved on." Jake's voice was rising now, months of suppressed frustration pouring out. "Do you know what Rachel did when she came back from Syria? She worked double shifts for 3 months to help pay for Natalie's engagement party. The woman who just spent a week in a combat zone was working overtime to fund a celebration for the sister who thinks she's ordinary." The room erupted. Dad was asking rapid-fire questions about the medical mission. Mom was crying and apologizing repeatedly. Natalie was shouting about feeling ambushed and manipulated. And through it all, I sat frozen, watching my family's carefully maintained equilibrium explode in real time. What none of us realized was that Marcus had been recording the entire conversation on his phone, not for malicious reasons, but because he'd promised Danny's widow he'd document the moment when Rachel Morrison finally received the recognition she deserved. By the next morning, that recording would be uploaded to social media with the caption, "When a family finally learns who their daughter really is." Within 6 hours, it would have 50,000 views. Within 24 hours, it would be trending on 3 platforms. The quiet life I'd built was about to become very, very public. The backlash started before I even knew the video existed. I woke up Tuesday morning to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. My phone was buzzing so constantly that I thought there might be a family emergency. The first message I opened was from my colleague Dr. Sarah Kim. "Rachel, I don't know what happened, but you need to see this. Call me ASAP." The second was from my nursing supervisor. "We need to talk. Please come in early today." The third made my blood run cold. It was from an unknown number. "Saw your family drama online. Looks like someone's desperate for attention. Real heroes don't need publicity stunts." I stumbled to my laptop, hands shaking as I typed my name into Google. The first result was a YouTube video entitled "Sister Gets Reality Check About War Hero Sibling," with 847,000 views. Posted 18 hours ago. I clicked play and watched in horror as Marcus's phone recording played out across my screen. The audio was crystal clear, capturing every word of Sunday's dinner conversation. But this wasn't just documentation. Someone had edited the footage, adding dramatic music, zooming in on faces at crucial moments, inserting text overlays that read, "Family doesn't know she's a war hero," and "Sister's reaction will shock you." The comments section was a battlefield. Thousands of people dissecting every word, every expression, every family dynamic they could glimpse in the 47-minute video. Most were supportive. "This woman is a real hero and her family treated her like garbage. The sister is so jealous it's pathetic. Imagine being mad that your sibling saved lives. Props to the Marine for standing up for her. That family owes her a massive apology." But mixed in were others that made my stomach churn. "Something's fishy about this. Why would a war hero hide what she did unless she's lying? Classic attention-seeking behavior. She probably set this whole thing up. Military people always think they're better than everyone else." By noon, the video had been shared across every social media platform. TikTok users were creating reaction videos. Twitter was debating whether Jake had violated Natalie's privacy by exposing family dysfunction. Instagram accounts dedicated to military stories were reposting clips with captions about "hidden heroes" and "toxic family dynamics." The Hartford Children's Hospital parking lot was full of news vans when I arrived for my shift. Reporters with microphones ambushed me at the entrance, shouting questions about my military service, my family relationships, and whether I felt vindicated by the public support. "Ms. Morrison, how does it feel to finally get recognition for your heroism? Are you planning to press charges against your sister for defamation? What's your response to claims that this was staged for social media fame?" I pushed through the crowd without comment, but the damage was spreading inside the hospital too. Colleagues who'd worked with me for years suddenly looked at me differently, some with new respect, others with suspicion. The video had revealed not just my military service, but the dysfunction in my family, the years of being overlooked and dismissed. Some people saw it as inspiring, others saw it as dirty laundry that should have stayed private. Dr. Patricia Williams, the pediatric department chief, called me into her office before my shift started. She was a woman I'd always respected, brilliant, fair, someone who'd risen through the ranks by merit rather than politics. But today her expression was concerned. "Rachel, I need you to understand the position this puts the hospital in," she said, gesturing to her computer screen where the video was paused on a frame showing my face. "We're getting calls from reporters, from military families wanting to thank you, from people questioning whether we properly vetted your credentials." My credentials? I couldn't hide the hurt in my voice. Dr. Williams, you know my work. You know my training. I do, and that's not the issue. The issue is that this has become a media circus, and it's affecting our ability to operate normally. The pediatric ICU had 3 reporters try to gain access this morning, claiming they wanted to document where a real hero works. She leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. I'm going to ask you to take administrative leave for the rest of the week. Let this blow over. Come back Monday when things have calmed down. Administrative leave. The words hit like a physical blow. I'd never taken leave that wasn't scheduled vacation or legitimate sick days. The implication was clear: my presence was causing problems, disrupting the workplace, making things difficult for everyone else. Dr. Williams, I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't post that video or seek out media attention. I know, Rachel. But sometimes the things we don't ask for still become our responsibility to manage. I drove home in a daze, my phone continuing to buzz with messages, friend requests, interview offers, and increasingly aggressive comments from strangers who felt entitled to judge my life based on a 47-minute video. The apartment building's parking lot had its own collection of news vans, forcing me to park 3 blocks away and sneak in through the back entrance. But the worst was waiting in my voicemail. Rachel, it's Mom. I don't understand what's happening. Mrs. Patterson from church called to say we're all over the internet. People are saying terrible things about our family. About Natalie. The wedding planner called and said there are protesters outside her office. Protesters, Rachel. At Natalie's wedding planner. How could you let this happen? The accusation in her voice was unmistakable. Somehow, this was my fault. The years of being overlooked, the family dinner that had exposed our dysfunction, the viral video I hadn't created or approved, all of it was being laid at my feet because I was the common denominator. The second voicemail was from Natalie, and it was worse. You destroyed my life. Her voice was hoarse from crying. Jake called off the wedding. Did you know that? He said he couldn't marry someone who would treat a hero the way I treated you. 3 months before our wedding, Rachel. 3 months. Her sobbing was audible through the phone. The venue is threatening to sue us for the deposit. My bridesmaids are asking if the whole family is as toxic as we look online. My boss saw the video and asked if I might be happier working somewhere else. Everything I've worked for, everything I've built, it's all gone because you couldn't just stay quiet about your little war stories. Little war stories. Even now, even after seeing the military documentation, even after Jake's testimony about what I'd done, Natalie still couldn't acknowledge the reality of what had happened in Syria. It was easier to blame me for not keeping secrets than to confront her own behavior. The third voicemail was from Jake, and his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Rachel, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. Marcus posted the video because he thought people should know what you did, but neither of us anticipated how big this would get or how cruel some people would be. He paused, and I could hear voices in the background, other Marines, maybe, or family members dealing with their own fallout. I called off the wedding. I couldn't go through with marrying someone who would rather attack you than acknowledge what you sacrificed. But I need you to know that I never wanted this to hurt you professionally or personally. If you need me to make a statement, to take responsibility for recording the conversation, I will. The irony wasn't lost on me. Jake was offering to sacrifice his own reputation to protect mine, the same kind of selfless gesture that had gotten me into this mess in the first place. By evening, the story had grown beyond just the family dinner video. Military bloggers had dug up additional information about the Syria mission. A war correspondent who'd been embedded with Jake's unit had written a detailed account of the siege, including quotes from Marines who remembered the civilian nurse who'd risked everything to save them. Suddenly, the internet had a more complete picture of what had actually happened, and the narrative was shifting in my favor. But that shift came with its own complications. I was being held up as a symbol, the modest hero, the forgotten woman, the family scapegoat who'd been vindicated by truth. People were using my story to make points about military service, about family dynamics, about women's roles in society. I'd become less a person than a character in other people's arguments. The culmination came at 11 p.m. when my doorbell rang. I peered through the peephole to see a young woman with a microphone and a cameraman behind her. "Ms. Morrison? I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 8 News. I was hoping you might comment on the allegations your sister made this evening on her Instagram live stream." My heart sank. I pulled up Natalie's Instagram on my phone and found a video posted 2 hours earlier. She was sitting in what looked like her apartment, makeup smeared, eyes red from crying. But her voice was steady, calculating. "I want people to understand that my sister has always been manipulative," she was saying to her phone camera. "This whole thing was orchestrated to make me look bad before my wedding. She's always been jealous that I found happiness, that I was getting married while she's still alone." The comments were brutal, but not in the way I expected. People weren't buying Natalie's version anymore. They'd seen too much evidence, heard too many corroborating accounts. Her attempt at damage control had only made things worse. "Your sister saved lives and you're worried about your wedding," one comment read. "The audacity to call a war hero manipulative because your fiancé has a conscience," read another. I turned off my phone and sat in my dark apartment, listening to the reporters camping outside, watching my family implode on social media, and wondering how doing the right thing in Syria 3 years ago had led to this moment where nothing in my life remained private or sacred. Tomorrow would bring congressional representatives reaching out about military recognition ceremonies. Talk show producers offering exclusive interviews. A book agent who wanted to help me tell my story. And through it all, the growing realization that the quiet life I'd built was gone forever. The woman who'd flown under the radar for 26 years was about to discover that sometimes visibility is the cruelest punishment of all. The escape came from the most unexpected source, my childhood bedroom. After 3 days of media madness, death threats mixed with marriage proposals in my inbox, and Natalie's increasingly unhinged social media posts claiming I'd orchestrated everything to steal her thunder, I drove back to my parents' house in Fairhaven. Not because I wanted a reunion, but because it was the only place the reporters hadn't figured out how to access yet. The house sat on Maple Street exactly as I remembered it, a modest colonial with faded blue shutters and a front porch that sagged slightly on the left side. Dad's accounting practice had never quite provided enough for major home improvements, but Mom had always made it presentable with seasonal wreaths and carefully tended flower boxes. Now, those same flower boxes were trampled from reporters who'd tried to peer through the front windows. The mailbox hung at an odd angle, apparently damaged when a news van had backed into it. Even my childhood home bore the scars of this unwanted attention. Mom met me at the back door, her face haggard in a way that made her look 10 years older than she had at Sunday dinner just a week ago. "Thank God you're here," she said, pulling me into a hug that felt desperate. "I don't know what to do about any of this." Dad was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, scrolling through article after article about our family. "Rachel, honey, I've been reading about what you did in Syria. The medical reports, the testimonials from those Marines. I had no idea. I'm so proud of you." The words I'd waited 26 years to hear, and they came only after the entire world had forced him to pay attention. I felt nothing, not vindication, not relief, just exhaustion. "Where's Natalie?" I asked. Mom and Dad exchanged glances. She's staying with the Hendersons for now," Mom said carefully. "After Jake called off the wedding, she didn't want to be here. She says being in this house reminds her of Sunday dinner." Of course. Even in crisis, even when her lies had been exposed to millions of people, Natalie had found a way to make herself the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of them. "The thing is," Dad continued, "we need to figure out how to handle all this media attention. Your mother's been getting calls from people claiming to be producers, journalists, even someone who said he was from the Pentagon. That caught my attention." "The Pentagon?" "Something about a ceremony. Recognition for your service." "But Rachel, we don't know what's real anymore. Half these people could be scammers trying to profit off your story." I spent the next hour explaining what I could about the situation, though honestly, I understood very little of it myself. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing and mutating as it spread across platforms. Facts were being mixed with speculation, my medical mission was being conflated with combat service I'd never performed, and my family drama was being used as ammunition in political arguments about military funding and veteran support. I think I need some time to process all this, I said finally. Maybe I could stay in my old room for a few days? Just until I figure out next steps. Of course, sweetheart, Mom said immediately. Nothing's changed up there. We always kept it ready for you. That turned out to be more true than I'd expected. Walking into my childhood bedroom was like stepping through a time portal. The same twin bed with its blue and white checkered comforter. The same desk where I'd done homework every night. The same bookshelf lined with medical textbooks I'd collected starting in high school, dreaming of the career I was now being forced to defend publicly. But it was the closet that yielded the discovery that would change everything. I was looking for my old photo albums, hoping to find pictures that might help me remember who I'd been before all this chaos, when I noticed a box I didn't recognize sitting on the top shelf. It was labeled Rachel, College Papers, in my mother's careful handwriting, but I didn't remember leaving any college materials at home. I pulled down the box and found something that made my hands tremble, a thick folder containing every news clipping, every award certificate, every letter of recommendation from my academic and early career years. Articles from the local paper when I'd graduated valedictorian. A copy of my acceptance letter to nursing school with a handwritten note in the margin, "So proud, Mom." The certificate from my pediatric trauma certification. Even a printout of an email from my supervisor at Hartford Children's praising my work during a particularly difficult case. At the bottom of the folder was a letter addressed to me, but never sent. The envelope was yellowed with age, postmarked 3 years ago, right after I would have returned from Syria. Inside was 2 pages in my mother's handwriting. My dearest Rachel, I don't know how to say this to your face, so I'm writing it down, even though I may never be brave enough to give this to you. When you came home from your mission overseas, you looked different. Older somehow, like you'd seen things that changed you. I wanted to ask about it, wanted to understand what you'd experienced, but I was afraid of the answer. The letter continued, "I've always been proud of you, sweetheart, but I've never been good at showing it. When you were little, you were so capable, so independent, that it was easy to focus on Natalie because she needed more help. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing that you needed things too, maybe not help with homework or comfort after nightmares, but acknowledgement, appreciation, someone to notice all the ways you were extraordinary." My vision blurred as I read the next paragraph. "I called the hospital where you volunteered overseas. I told them I was your mother and asked if they could tell me anything about your service there. The coordinator spent 20 minutes telling me about your courage, your skill, how you'd volunteered for the most dangerous assignments and saved lives under impossible conditions. She said you were one of the most remarkable people she'd ever worked with." The letter's final paragraph broke me. "I wrote this letter a dozen times and never sent any of them because I don't know how to admit that I failed you. How do I tell my daughter that I was too insecure, too focused on keeping peace in our house, to properly celebrate her achievements? How do I explain that I let Natalie diminish you because it was easier than dealing with her jealousy if we praised you appropriately?" There was a postscript. "I put together this collection because I wanted you to know that someone was paying attention, even when it didn't look like it. I saved every article, every achievement, every sign that my daughter was becoming someone remarkable. I'm sorry I didn't tell you while it was happening. I'm sorry I waited until you might leave us forever to realize what I was losing. I sat on my childhood bed, surrounded by evidence that my mother had seen me all along, had been quietly documenting my achievements, researching my overseas service, recognizing my worth even while publicly failing to acknowledge it. The disconnect was staggering and heartbreaking. A woman who loved her daughter enough to secretly preserve every sign of her success, but who lacked the courage to celebrate that success openly." There was a soft knock on my door. "Rachel?" Mom's voice was tentative. "I brought you some tea." She entered carrying a steaming mug and froze when she saw the box contents spread across my bed, the letter still in my hands. Her face went pale, then red, then crumpled entirely. "You weren't supposed to find that yet," she whispered, sitting heavily on the edge of the bed. "I was waiting for the right time to give it to you." "When would have been the right time, Mom? After I died? After I moved away and never came back?" I don't know, she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. I've spent 3 years trying to figure out how to have this conversation. How to admit that I've been a coward. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 26 years of misunderstanding settling between us. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of traffic, neighbors going about their normal lives while our family's dysfunction was dissected by strangers on the internet. The Syria mission coordinator, Mom said finally, she told me something else. She said you specifically requested not to have your service publicized, that you declined interviews and refused to have your photo used in their promotional materials. She said you told them that you didn't do it for recognition. She looked at me with eyes full of regret. That's when I realized we'd raised you to expect nothing from us. We trained you to be invisible, and you learned the lesson so well that you kept being invisible even when you were being heroic. The conversation was interrupted by Dad calling up the stairs. Rachel? There are some men here to see you. They say they're from the Marine Corps. My heart sank, assuming it was more media attention disguised as official business. But when I came downstairs, I found 2 Marines in dress blue uniforms standing in our living room with the kind of bearing that told me this wasn't about publicity. Ms. Morrison, the older officer said, I'm Colonel David Patterson, and this is Lieutenant Colonel James Murphy. We're here on official business regarding your service in Syria. What they told me next would force me to confront not just my family's failures, but a government conspiracy that had been covering up the truth about my mission for 3 years. The documents they showed me would prove that someone very powerful had been deliberately suppressing recognition of my service, and they were about to explain why. Colonel Patterson opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder bearing official Department of Defense seals. Ms. Morrison, what I'm about to show you is classified material that's being declassified specifically for this conversation. Before we proceed, I need you to understand that this information has been deliberately withheld from you for 3 years. He handed me a document titled, After Action Report, Operation Nightingale, Syria Medical Extraction Mission. My hands shook as I read the header. I'd never heard the mission referred to by that name before. Operation Nightingale? I asked. Lieutenant Colonel Murphy leaned forward. That's what we called your mission internally. What you thought was a routine medical volunteer assignment was actually a classified operation designed to extract a high-value intelligence asset from Syrian territory. The words hit me like ice water. What are you talking about? I was there with Doctors Without Borders, treating civilian casualties. You were, Colonel Patterson confirmed, but Dr. Khalil Hassan, the Syrian physician you worked most closely with, was feeding intelligence to U.S. forces about ISIS operations in the region. He'd requested extraction for himself and his family, but the political situation made official military action impossible. I remembered Dr. Hassan clearly, a brilliant surgeon who'd somehow managed to keep practicing medicine despite the chaos around us. He'd worked beside me during those terrible days when Jake's unit was trapped, translating for patients, helping coordinate with local contacts who could provide additional medical supplies. The plan, Murphy continued, was for Dr. Hassan to disappear during the chaos of a medical evacuation. He'd be listed as killed in the bombing that destroyed the clinic, but actually extracted to safety. What we didn't anticipate was Marines getting trapped in a firefight that would require civilian medical intervention. Colonel Patterson pulled out another document, a timeline that made my stomach clench. When Jake Rodriguez's unit called for medical support, command had to make a choice. Abort Dr. Hassan's extraction or risk exposing the operation by allowing a civilian volunteer to enter the combat zone. They chose the extraction, I said, the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. They chose both, Murphy corrected. They decided you were committed enough, skilled enough, and brave enough to handle the medical emergency while providing cover for the intelligence operation. Dr. Hassan used the chaos of treating wounded Marines to pass final intelligence packages and coordinate his family's evacuation route. The betrayal was staggering. I'd thought I was volunteering for humanitarian medical work. Instead, I'd been unknowingly recruited as cover for an espionage operation, my medical skills exploited to provide legitimacy for intelligence activities I'd never consented to participate in. Every minute you spent treating those Marines, Patterson continued, Dr. Hassan was using the time to transfer classified information about ISIS leadership, weapons caches, and planned attacks. Information that prevented at least 4 major terrorist operations over the following year. He handed me a series of photographs, surveillance images of me working on the wounded Marines while Dr. Hassan moved in the background, clearly engaged in activities that had nothing to do with medical care. In one image, I was performing CPR on Martinez while Hassan passed a small package to a man I didn't recognize. In another, I was setting Colin's broken leg while Hassan operated some kind of radio equipment. "You saved those Marines," Murphy said, "but you also unknowingly provided cover for one of the most successful intelligence operations we've run in the region." Dr. Hassan's intelligence prevented the bombing of a school in Aleppo, stopped a planned attack on a refugee camp, and helped us locate and rescue 14 kidnapped aid workers. The scope of what I'd been unknowingly involved in was overwhelming, but it didn't explain the cover-up. Why was this kept secret from me? Why wasn't I debriefed when I returned? Colonel Patterson's expression darkened. "Because 3 weeks after your return, Dr. Hassan was killed in what appeared to be a retaliatory strike. Someone had leaked information about his cooperation with U.S. intelligence. The operation was compromised, and everyone connected to it became a security risk." He pulled out another set of documents, communications between various government agencies, all heavily redacted. The decision was made at the highest levels to classify everything related to Operation Nightingale. That included your involvement, your medical heroics, and any recognition you might have received. "Someone buried my service record," I said, understanding flooding through me. "Not just buried, actively suppressed. Every recommendation for commendation, every after-action report that mentioned your name, every piece of documentation that could connect you to the intelligence operation was classified and sealed." Murphy opened his own folder. "Ms. Morrison, in the past 3 years, you've been recommended for the Presidential Medal of Freedom twice, the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, and the Secretary of State's Award for Outstanding Volunteerism. All of those recommendations were blocked by the same office." "Which office?" "The Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations. A man named Richard Blackwood." The name meant nothing to me, but Colonel Patterson's expression suggested it should. Blackwood was Dr. Hassan's handler. He coordinated the intelligence operation, managed the extraction, and made the decision to classify your involvement. "But there's more." He handed me a photograph of a man in his 50s, distinguished-looking with silver hair and expensive suits. "Richard Blackwood is also Congressman Blackwood's older brother. And Congressman Timothy Blackwood has been positioning himself as a champion of military transparency and veteran recognition for the past 2 years." The political implications hit me immediately. If it came out that Richard Blackwood had been suppressing recognition for a legitimate war hero while his brother campaigned on supporting veterans, it would destroy both their careers. "The viral video forced their hand," Murphy explained. "Once your story became public, they couldn't keep the classification in place without raising questions about why a documented hero had been ignored by the system." Colonel Patterson pulled out one final document, a presidential commendation dated for next week. "Ms. Morrison, the President has decided to declassify Operation Nightingale and formally recognize your service. But before that happens, you need to understand what you'll be walking into." He leaned back, his expression grave. "Richard Blackwood has spent 3 years building a political career partly on the foundation of keeping your heroism secret. When this comes out, he's going to claim that you were a security risk, that recognizing you would have endangered other operations, that the classification was necessary for national security. And the truth? The truth is that Blackwood panicked when Dr. Hassan was killed. Instead of properly debriefing you and managing the security implications professionally, he chose to bury everything and hope it never surfaced. He's been covering his own mistakes for 3 years at the expense of your recognition and career." Lieutenant Colonel Murphy stood and handed me a business card. "Ms. Morrison, what I'm about to tell you is off the record, but you deserve to know. There are people in the Pentagon who have been fighting this classification for 3 years. The viral video didn't just embarrass your family, it gave us the political cover we needed to finally do what should have been done when you returned from Syria." Colonel Patterson gathered the documents. "You have a choice to make. You can accept the recognition privately, with minimal publicity, and let the Blackwood brothers continue their careers with a quiet reprimand. Or you can allow the full story to come out publicly, which will destroy them but subject you to even more intense media scrutiny. I thought about the past week, the reporters, the death threats, the way my quiet life had been torn apart by forces beyond my control. I thought about Natalie's wedding being called off, my job being put on administrative leave, my family's dysfunction being dissected by strangers on the internet. And I thought about Dr. Hassan, who died because someone had leaked information about his cooperation. About the Marines who'd almost died because political considerations had nearly prevented their rescue. About 3 years of wondering if what I'd done in Syria had actually mattered, or if I'd simply been in the right place at the right time. How long do I have to decide? The ceremony is scheduled for Friday. That gives you 4 days to consider your options. But Ms. Morrison, Colonel Patterson's voice carried a weight that made me pay attention. Whatever you choose, the people you saved, both the Marines and the civilians Dr. Hassan's intelligence protected, they know what you did. The recognition is just catching up to the reality. After the Marines left, I sat in the living room with my parents, all of us trying to process what we'd just learned. My mother was crying again, but these were different tears, tears of pride mixed with anger at the injustice of what had been done to me. 3 years, Dad kept repeating. 3 years they kept this from you. But I was thinking about something else entirely. Somewhere in Washington, Richard Blackwood was probably in crisis meetings, trying to figure out how to manage the exposure of Operation Nightingale. He'd spent 3 years sacrificing my recognition to protect his own career, and now he was about to pay the price. The question was, how much was I willing to pay to make sure he did? Friday's ceremony would force me to choose between justice and privacy, between exposing the truth and protecting what remained of my quiet life. But first, I had a phone call to make to someone who deserved to hear this story directly. Jake Rodriguez was about to learn that the woman he defended at a family dinner had been fighting much larger battles than either of them had realized. I called Jake from my childhood bedroom, staring out the same window where I'd once dreamed of escaping to a life that mattered. His voice was hoarse when he answered, like he'd been fielding difficult calls all day. Rachel? God, I'm so sorry about everything. The video, the media circus, your job, none of this was supposed to happen. Jake, we need to talk. In person. There's something about Syria you don't know, something that changes everything. 2 hours later, we met at Riverside Park, the same place where Natalie and I had played as children. It was neutral ground, public enough that we couldn't be accused of anything inappropriate, but private enough for the conversation I needed to have. Jake looked exhausted, his usually perfect military bearing sagging under the weight of the past week. Before you say anything, he started, I need you to know that I've taken full responsibility for the recording. I told Marcus to post a statement saying I authorized it, that you had no knowledge of what we were planning. I held up my hand to stop him. That's not why I called you here. I handed him the declassified documents Colonel Patterson had left with me. Read the operation summary first. Jake's eyes widened as he scanned the papers. Operation Nightingale? I've never heard this designation before. He read further, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to something approaching anger. They classified your involvement? They've been sitting on this for 3 years? That's not the worst part, I said, handing him the communications between government agencies. Read the section about why the classification was maintained. Jake's jaw tightened as he read. When he finished, he looked up at me with fury in his eyes. This Blackwood character buried your recognition to protect his own political interests, while his brother campaigned on supporting veterans? It gets worse. I showed him the timeline of blocked commendations, the repeated recommendations that had been suppressed, the evidence that my service had been not just ignored but actively hidden. Jake, everything you thought you knew about why I never received recognition, it wasn't because I kept quiet about it. Someone was keeping it quiet for me. Jake stood and paced to the edge of the pond, his hands clenched into fists. Danny spent 2 years searching for you. 2 years thinking the system had failed, that bureaucracy had somehow overlooked your service. He died believing that his country had forgotten the woman who saved his life. The pain in his voice was raw, immediate. If he'd known that someone was deliberately hiding your story, it would have destroyed him. Danny believed in the system, believed that heroes eventually got recognized. This would have shattered everything he thought he knew about honor and service. I joined him by the water's edge. There's more. The ceremony they're planning, it's this Friday. Full presidential recognition, declassification of the entire operation, media coverage. But they're giving me a choice about how public to make it. What kind of choice? Accept the recognition quietly, let the Blackwood brothers survive with a reprimand, keep the intelligence operation details classified. Or expose everything publicly, destroy their careers, but subject myself to even more intense scrutiny. Jake turned to study my face. What are you leaning toward? I'd been wrestling with the question since the Marines left. Part of me wants to stay quiet. I've had enough publicity to last a lifetime. My job, my family, my entire life has been turned upside down by that dinner video. The idea of more media attention, more strangers dissecting my choices. But Danny died not knowing the truth. You spent months believing your country had failed him. How many other families are out there wondering why their loved one's heroism was ignored? How many other veterans had their recognition suppressed to protect political careers? Jake sat heavily on a park bench. You're not just deciding about your own recognition. You're deciding whether to expose systemic corruption. Exactly. And I'm realizing that staying quiet, which has been my instinct my entire life, might not be the right choice this time. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching ducks paddle across the pond while joggers and families with children moved through the park around us. Normal life continuing while we grappled with questions that felt impossibly large. There's something else, I said finally. I need to tell you what happened after I got home. The real reason my family never knew about Syria. Jake looked puzzled. What do you mean? I pulled out my mother's unsent letter, the one I discovered in the box of clippings. My mother knew. She researched my service, contacted the volunteer organization, collected evidence of everything I'd accomplished. But she never had the courage to acknowledge it publicly. I handed him the letter and watched his expression change as he read my mother's confession of pride mixed with cowardice. Your whole family knew you were extraordinary. They just didn't know how to handle it. That's the part that's been eating at me, I admitted. Even before the government cover-up, even before Richard Blackwood classified everything, my own family was already making me invisible. The suppression just gave official weight to what they were already doing. Jake folded the letter carefully and handed it back. So this isn't really about whether to expose Blackwood. It's about whether to stop letting other people define your worth. The insight hit like a revelation. For 26 years, I'd allowed my family to minimize my achievements. For 3 years, I'd allowed the government to bury my service. Even now, I was considering staying quiet partly because speaking up felt too much like seeking attention, the same shame that had kept me silent since childhood. You know what Danny used to say about heroes? Jake asked. He said the real ones never recognize themselves. They think what they did was ordinary, just what anyone would have done. But that's exactly why their stories need to be told, because they'll never tell them themselves. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Morrison, this is David Shen from the Washington Post. We'd like to discuss your upcoming ceremony and what it means for veteran recognition policies. Would you be available for an interview? More messages followed. Producers from 60 Minutes. A documentary filmmaker who wanted to explore government suppression of military recognition. A veteran advocacy group asking if I'd testify before Congress about systemic problems in the honor system. They already know, I said, showing Jake the messages. Word is leaking about Friday's ceremony. The choice about publicity might be taken away from me. Jake stood and offered me his hand. Then maybe the question isn't whether to go public. Maybe it's whether to control the narrative yourself or let other people tell your story for you. As we walked back toward our cars, Jake asked one more question that stopped me cold. What would you tell a patient's family if they asked whether they should demand answers about medical malpractice, even if pursuing it would be emotionally difficult? I thought about the families I'd counseled, the parents who'd struggled with whether to fight systems that had failed their children. I'd tell them that justice isn't just about their specific case. It's about preventing the same thing from happening to other families. And what would you tell a young nurse who asked whether she should speak up about dangerous conditions in her hospital, even if it might hurt her career? I'd tell her that staying silent protects the system more than it protects her. Jake smiled sadly. You've been giving other people courage to fight for what's right your whole career. Maybe it's time to take your own advice. That evening, I sat down with my parents and told them about my decision. They listened without interruption as I explained the choice I faced, the implications of going public, the price we'd all pay for full transparency. When I finished, Dad was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised me. Rachel, for 26 years, we've been protecting Natalie from consequences and protecting ourselves from conflict. Maybe it's time someone in this family chose to do what's right instead of what's comfortable. Mom nodded through her tears. We failed you by staying silent. Don't fail other people by making the same mistake. At 9 p.m., I called the Washington Post reporter and agreed to an exclusive interview. At 9:15, I called Colonel Patterson and told him I wanted full declassification and complete transparency about Operation Nightingale. At 9:30, my phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown, but when I answered, a familiar voice came through, angry, desperate, and barely controlled. Ms. Morrison, this is Richard Blackwood. I think we need to have a conversation before you make any decisions you'll regret. The man who'd buried my recognition for 3 years was calling to threaten me. And I was finally ready to stop being afraid. Mr. Blackwood, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. I was wondering when you'd call. There was a pause, then a forced laugh. Ms. Morrison, I think there's been some misunderstanding about the classification of Operation Nightingale. I'd like the opportunity to explain the national security implications before you make any hasty decisions about Friday's ceremony. Hasty decisions? You mean like the hasty decision to bury my service record for 3 years? Now see here, his composure cracked slightly. The classification was necessary to protect ongoing intelligence operations. We couldn't risk exposing methods and sources that are still active in the field. Interesting. Because Colonel Patterson showed me the declassification review. According to the intelligence community assessment, there are no active operations that would be compromised by recognizing my service. The only thing at risk is your reputation. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from diplomatic to threatening. Ms. Morrison, you're a nurse from a small Connecticut town. You have no idea how complex these intelligence operations are, or how many lives could be at risk if classified information becomes public. I strongly advise you to reconsider your cooperation with the media. Is that a threat, Mr. Blackwood? It's a reality check. Do you really want to be responsible for exposing intelligence assets? For compromising future operations that could prevent terrorist attacks? I had spent the afternoon reading every declassified document the Marines had provided, consulting with intelligence experts Jake had connected me with, understanding exactly what information would and wouldn't be revealed. Blackwood was lying, and we both knew it. The only intelligence operation I'd be exposing, I said calmly, is the one where you use my medical mission as cover without my knowledge or consent. And the only lives at risk are the political lives of you and your brother. You're making a serious mistake. His voice turned cold. You have no idea what you're dealing with. There are ways to discredit people who don't cooperate with national security priorities. Like what? Are you going to claim I was a security risk? That a pediatric nurse who volunteered to treat wounded Marines was somehow dangerous to American interests? I'm going to claim that you're an unstable attention seeker who's exploiting military service for personal gain. Your own family's public dysfunction demonstrates a pattern of narcissistic behavior. Your sister's social media posts about your manipulation are quite compelling. My blood ran cold. He'd been monitoring my family, gathering ammunition to use against me if I refused to stay quiet. You've been watching us. I've been protecting an ongoing national security matter. When your family dinner video went viral, my office began monitoring all associated social media activity to assess potential damage to classified operations. Natalie's posts, I realized. You're the one encouraging her to attack my credibility. Your sister didn't need encouragement. She was quite eager to share her perspective about your character when my staff reached out to her. Apparently, she has years of examples of your attention-seeking behavior. The manipulation was breathtaking. Blackwood had identified Natalie as a weapon against me and was actively using her jealousy and resentment to undermine my credibility. Her increasingly unhinged Instagram posts weren't just emotional breakdowns, they were being coached and amplified by someone with political motivations. What did you offer her? I asked. Nothing inappropriate. Simply an opportunity to tell her side of the story to sympathetic journalists. Amazing how quickly the narrative changes when people understand that the supposed hero has a history of manipulating family situations for personal advantage. I thought about Natalie's recent posts, the way she'd shifted from defending her mockery of my service to attacking my character more broadly. The language had become more sophisticated, more strategically focused on undermining my credibility rather than just expressing hurt feelings. You're coaching her attacks on me. I'm simply ensuring that all perspectives are represented in the media coverage. Your sister deserves to have her voice heard, don't you think? She's the victim here, her wedding destroyed, her reputation damaged, her family torn apart by your need for recognition. The phone call was being recorded. I'd started the app as soon as I recognized his voice. Every threat, every admission of manipulation, every detail of how he'd weaponized my own sister against me was being documented. Mr. Blackwood, I want to make sure I understand your position. You're saying that if I proceed with Friday's ceremony and cooperate with media coverage, you'll orchestrate a campaign to destroy my credibility using my sister's resentment as ammunition? I'm saying that the full story about your character and motivations will come to light. Your pattern of creating family drama for attention, your exploitation of military service for personal gain, your willingness to destroy your sister's happiness to satisfy your own ego, all of it will be thoroughly documented. And if I agree to accept the recognition quietly? Let you and your brother continue your careers without exposure? Then your sister can heal from this trauma privately. Your family can repair their relationships without ongoing media scrutiny. You can return to your quiet life as a respected nurse without having your personal history dissected by strangers. The offer was clear: stay silent about the suppression of my recognition, and he'd call off the character assassination campaign. Speak publicly about Operation Nightingale, and he'd use Natalie's jealousy to destroy my reputation. I need to ask you something, Mr. Blackwood. Do you have children? The question seemed to catch him off guard. I don't see how that's relevant. Because I work with children every day. Kids who are fighting for their lives, whose parents would do anything to save them. And I've learned something important about courage from watching those families. I stood and walked to my bedroom window, looking out at the street where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to be invisible to keep peace in my family. Real courage isn't about avoiding consequences, I continued. It's about accepting them when the alternative is letting injustice continue. You're betting that I'll choose comfort over truth, that I'll protect my family's privacy over other veterans' recognition. I'm offering you a way out of a situation that will destroy everything you've built. No, Mr. Blackwood. You're offering me the same deal I've been accepting my whole life: stay quiet, stay invisible, let powerful people make decisions about my worth while I smile and pretend it's okay. I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice carried the desperation of someone whose bluff had been called. Ms. Morrison, you're making a grave error. When this is over, when your 15 minutes of fame fade and the media moves on to the next story, you'll be left with the consequences of your choices. Your family relationships destroyed, your career damaged by association with political controversy, your privacy gone forever. Is exposing my office really worth all that? Yes, I said without hesitation. Because staying silent means other heroes will have their recognition suppressed when it's politically convenient. It means other families will wonder why their loved one's sacrifice was ignored. It means you and people like you will keep trading veterans' honor for political advantage. There was a long pause. When Blackwood spoke again, his voice was flat, defeated. You have no idea what you've just set in motion. Actually, I do. I've set the truth in motion. And unlike you, I'm not afraid of where it leads. I hung up and immediately called Colonel Patterson to report the threatening conversation. Then I called the Washington Post reporter to share the recording. Finally, I called Jake to warn him that the attacks on my character were about to escalate dramatically. "Let them come," Jake said when I explained Blackwood's strategy. "Danny's unit is already organizing to counter any smear campaign. When you have 17 Marines willing to testify about your character under oath, political spin becomes pretty ineffective." That night, as I prepared for what I knew would be the most difficult week of my life, I thought about the choice Blackwood had offered me. Safety in silence, or truth at the cost of everything I'd built. For the first time since this nightmare began, the decision felt easy. I'd spent 26 years choosing silence. It was time to choose courage. The assault began at dawn on Thursday, exactly 24 hours before the presidential ceremony. I woke to my phone buzzing with alerts from Google searches I'd set up to monitor coverage of my story. The first headline made my stomach drop: "War hero or attention seeker? Sister reveals pattern of manipulation behind viral wedding video." The article, published by a conservative blog with significant readership, featured an exclusive interview with Natalie. But this wasn't the emotional, rambling Instagram posts from the past week. This was calculated, articulate, and devastating. "Rachel has always needed to be the center of attention," Natalie was quoted as saying. "When I was getting married, she couldn't stand that it wasn't about her. She deliberately created drama at my wedding to steal my spotlight, just like she's always done." The piece included childhood stories I'd never heard before, or rather, familiar events twisted beyond recognition. My helping Natalie with homework became controlling behavior. My working extra jobs to help with family expenses became making everyone feel guilty about money. My decision to join medical missions overseas became abandoning family when they needed her most. But the most damaging part was Natalie's description of my return from Syria. She came back acting like she was traumatized, but she never wanted to talk about what actually happened. She was secretive, evasive, always hinting that she'd done something important but never giving details. It felt like she was building up some big reveal for maximum impact. The implication was clear: I'd been sitting on the Syria story for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to deploy it for attention. The classification, the government suppression, the legitimate reasons for my silence, none of that was mentioned. By 8 a.m., the story had been picked up by 3 major news outlets. By 10 a.m., #AttentionSeekerRachel was trending on Twitter. By noon, reporters who'd been celebrating my heroism just days earlier were calling to ask about the allegations of manipulation. The coordinated nature of the attack was obvious to anyone paying attention. Natalie's interview had been professionally edited, her quotes crafted to hit specific talking points about my character. The story was being amplified by accounts with suspicious follower patterns and engagement metrics. This wasn't organic social media outrage. This was a professional opposition research operation. But the most heartbreaking part was watching my family fracture in real time. Mom called in tears. "Rachel, I don't understand what Natalie is saying. She's telling reporters that we were all afraid of you growing up, that you manipulated us into feeling guilty about your accomplishments. That's not how it was it?" The doubt in her voice was like a knife. After decades of dismissing my achievements, now she was questioning whether my memories of being overlooked were even real. Blackwood's strategy was working, not just discrediting me publicly, but making my own family doubt their treatment of me. Dad was more direct when he called an hour later. "Someone's been coaching Natalie. The language she's using, the way she's describing events, it doesn't sound like her. But Rachel, some of what she's saying, it's making me question things I thought I remembered." That was the insidious brilliance of the campaign. Take real events and reframe them through the lens of manipulation. Make my family wonder if their own memories were wrong, if my selflessness had actually been control, if my invisibility had been calculated victimhood. Jake called at 2 p.m. with intelligence from his military contacts. "They're not just going after you. Blackwood's people are digging into every Marine from Danny's unit, looking for anything they can use to discredit testimonials about your service. They're claiming the whole thing is a military conspiracy to create propaganda heroes." The scope of the attack was staggering. This wasn't just about suppressing one nurse's recognition, it was about undermining the credibility of military testimony itself. If they could make me look like a fraud, they could question any veteran's account of my service. There's more, Jake continued. Marcus got a call this morning from someone claiming to be a journalist, asking about the recording equipment he used at your family dinner. They're building a case that the whole thing was staged, that we orchestrated the confrontation to create viral content. The recording of my conversation with Blackwood had been released by the Washington Post that morning, but instead of focusing on his threats, some outlets were questioning why I'd recorded the call in the first place. My documentation of his intimidation was being spun as evidence of my calculated nature. By 3 p.m., the hashtag had evolved to hashtag Serious Scandal, with posts claiming that the entire medical mission was fabricated. People were sharing side-by-side photos of me from the hospital and from Syria, claiming the time stamps didn't match, that my medical credentials couldn't be verified, that the Syrian photos looked staged. The attacks were so numerous and so detailed that fact-checkers couldn't keep up. By the time one false claim was debunked, 5 more had taken its place. The truth was drowning in a sea of manufactured doubt. At 4 p.m., my phone rang with a call from Dr. Patricia Williams at Hartford Children's Hospital. "Rachel, I need you to come in for a meeting tomorrow morning. We're getting calls from reporters asking about your employment history, your mental health records, whether there have been any complaints about your conduct with patients." "Are there any complaints?" "Of course not. Your record is spotless. But the administration is concerned about the hospital being drawn into a political controversy. We need to discuss how to move forward." The message was clear: my job was in jeopardy. The career I'd built over 15 years, the work I loved more than anything, was being threatened because I'd chosen to speak truth about government corruption. At 5 p.m., I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I got in my car and drove to Natalie's apartment. She was staying at a luxury complex downtown, paid for, I now realized, by whoever was funding this attack on my character. When she answered the door, she looked terrible, exhausted, hollow-eyed, but also defiant in a way I'd never seen before. "Rachel," she said, not stepping aside to let me in. "I saw the news. I heard your friend recorded our conversation at dinner. Always documenting things, aren't you? Natalie, we need to talk." "What you're doing?" "What I'm doing is finally telling my side of the story. For 26 years, you've been the saint and I've been the shallow one. Poor Rachel, so noble, so self-sacrificing. Well, people deserve to know what you're really like." I studied my sister's face, looking for signs of the woman who'd volunteered at the disaster shelter, who'd held those children while floodwaters rose around them. "This isn't you talking. Someone's been coaching you, feeding you talking points." "Oh, please. You think I can't form my own opinions about my own sister? You think I need someone to tell me how you made me feel invisible my whole life? Natalie, I know you're angry. I know you feel like..." "Like what?" "Like you orchestrated that whole dinner to humiliate me? Like you've been planning this moment for years, waiting to reveal your big secret and make me look like a monster?" The accusation was so far from reality that I almost laughed. But then I saw the genuine belief in her eyes. She wasn't lying for money or political advantage. She'd been convinced that her own memories were wrong, that my actions had always been calculated. "Who convinced you of that?" I asked gently. "Because 3 weeks ago, you knew it wasn't true. 3 weeks ago, you called me after Jake broke off the engagement and apologized for mocking my service." For just a moment, doubt flickered across her face. I was emotional then. I wasn't thinking clearly. "And you are now?" "After spending a week being coached by political operatives who want to use your pain to destroy my credibility?" "Nobody's using me," Natalie snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone and played the recording of Blackwood's call, specifically the part where he discussed using her social media posts to discredit me. I watched her face change as she heard his voice detailing how they'd been amplifying her attacks, coaching her responses, turning her genuine hurt into a political weapon. When the recording ended, Natalie sank into her couch, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. "They said they were helping me tell my story," she whispered. They said people needed to understand how you'd manipulated the situation. Nat, they were manipulating you. Using your hurt feelings to attack someone who threatens their political interests. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. But some of what I said, some of it was true. You did always make me feel like I wasn't good enough. I know, I said, sitting beside her. And I'm sorry for that. But that's different from orchestrating a 3-year plan to humiliate you at your wedding using military secrets I didn't even know existed. For the next hour, we talked honestly for the first time in years. About our childhood, our parents' favoritism, the ways we'd both been damaged by a family system that had pitted us against each other. About how my coping mechanism had been achievement and hers had been attention-seeking. About how neither of us had learned to love ourselves enough to stop competing with each other. When I left her apartment, Natalie had agreed to issue a statement clarifying that she'd been influenced by political operatives and that her attacks on my character had been exaggerated. It wouldn't undo the damage, but it might begin to repair it. As I drove home, I realized that Blackwood's assault had accomplished something he hadn't intended. It had forced my family to finally confront the dysfunction we'd all been dancing around for decades. Tomorrow's ceremony would determine whether that confrontation led to healing or complete destruction. The truth was about to set us all free, or finish tearing us apart. The East Room of the White House had never felt more intimidating. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over an audience of 200 people, military officials, members of Congress, veterans advocates, and journalists whose cameras would broadcast this moment to millions. I stood in the holding area just outside, wearing the navy blue dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion, my hands trembling despite my attempts to stay calm. Colonel Patterson appeared at my elbow. "Ms. Morrison, the president is ready." "Are you?" I thought about everything that had led to this moment, the family dinner that started it all, the viral video, the government cover-up, Blackwood's threats, Natalie's attacks. 26 years of being invisible had culminated in this, the most public moment of my life, with consequences I still couldn't fully predict. As ready as I'll ever be. The military aide opened the doors, and I walked into a room filled with people who were all there because of choices I'd made in a bombed-out building in Syria 3 years ago. The audience rose as I entered, their applause echoing off the formal walls of American power. But it was the people in the front row that made my breath catch. Jake sat in his dress blue uniform, flanked by 16 other Marines, Danny's entire unit, the men whose lives had intersected with mine for 6 terrible days. Some I recognized from medical records and evacuation reports. Others were complete strangers who'd been shadows in my peripheral vision while I worked to keep them alive. Next to them sat my parents, looking overwhelmed but proud in a way I'd never seen before. Dad wore the same suit he'd worn to Natalie's wedding, but his expression was completely different, focused, intentional, like he was finally seeing something clearly after years of looking through fog. And in the third row, almost hidden behind a pillar, sat Natalie. She wore a simple black dress, no makeup, her hair pulled back severely. When our eyes met, she gave me the smallest nod, not forgiveness, exactly, but acknowledgement. The statement she'd released that morning, retracting her character attacks and admitting to being manipulated, had begun trending within hours. #Sister Supporting Sisters was overtaking the negative hashtags. President Harrison stepped to the podium, his voice carrying the gravity appropriate for the moment. "We gather today to correct an injustice, not just to one individual, but to the principle that heroism should be recognized regardless of political convenience." He began recounting the details of Operation Nightingale that had been declassified for this ceremony. The intelligence operation Dr. Hassan had been running. The trapped Marines calling for help. My decision to enter the combat zone when no military medical personnel could reach them. For 6 days, the president continued, Rachel Morrison worked under conditions that would challenge seasoned combat medics. She performed emergency surgery with improvised equipment. She manually ventilated a patient for 14 hours when life support failed. She provided medical cover that allowed critical intelligence to be transferred, intelligence that prevented terrorist attacks and saved civilian lives across the region. The audience was silent except for the soft click of cameras. I found myself remembering those days not as the heroic narrative being presented, but as they'd actually been, terrifying, exhausting, driven more by stubbornness than courage. The decision to crawl through that minefield hadn't felt brave, it had felt necessary. The choice to stay when evacuation was offered hadn't felt noble, it had felt impossible to leave. Ms. Morrison's service was subsequently classified, the president said, his tone hardening slightly, not for legitimate national security reasons, but to protect the political interests of officials who had mismanaged the intelligence operation. For 3 years, her heroism was suppressed while those same officials built careers partly on claims of supporting veteran recognition. I glanced toward the press section and saw Richard Blackwood's political career ending in real time. Reporters were already typing on their phones, updating stories about his resignation, his brother's withdrawal from the congressional race, the investigation into their abuse of classification authority. Today, we not only recognize Ms. Morrison's extraordinary service, but recommit ourselves to ensuring that political considerations never again override the recognition our heroes deserve. The president turned toward me, and I stepped forward to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. As he placed the medal around my neck, I thought about Danny Vasquez, the Marine whose journal had started Jake's search for me. This recognition was as much his as mine, proof that the woman who'd saved his life was finally being seen by the country he'd died serving. The applause when the president finished was thunderous, but it was Jake's expression that mattered most to me. He was crying openly, his military composure abandoned, and I understood that this wasn't just recognition for my service, it was vindication for Danny's faith that heroes eventually get acknowledged. After the formal ceremony ended, I found myself in a receiving line that stretched across the East Room. Marines shaking my hand with tears in their eyes. Parents of soldiers thanking me for bringing their children home. Veterans who'd had their own recognition delayed or denied by political bureaucracy, telling me that today's ceremony gave them hope. But the conversation that meant the most happened in a quiet corner, away from cameras and crowds. "I'm proud of you," my mother said, the words she'd written in letters but never spoken aloud. "Not just for what you did in Syria, but for choosing to fight for the truth even when it would have been easier to stay quiet." Dad nodded beside her. "We failed you, Rachel. For 26 years, we taught you that being good meant being invisible, that your job was to make everyone else's life easier. We're sorry it took the whole world recognizing your worth before we did." The apologies I'd waited decades to hear, finally spoken when I no longer needed them to define my worth. The recognition felt hollow in some ways, coming only after external validation had forced their hand, but it was also necessary for whatever relationship we might build going forward. "Where do we go from here?" I asked. "Forward," Dad said simply. "We can't change the past, but we can choose to see you clearly from now on." Jake appeared beside us, still in his dress uniform, still emotional from the ceremony. "Ms. Morrison, Rachel, I need to tell you something Danny wrote that I never shared before." He pulled out the familiar journal, turning to a page near the end. This was his last entry before the mission where he died. He wrote, "If something happens to me, I need Jake to know that finding Iron Widow isn't about thanking her for saving us. It's about proving that quiet heroism gets recognized eventually, that the system works even when it takes time. Finding her means proving that doing the right thing matters, even when nobody's watching." Jake looked up from the journal. Today proved Danny right. The system worked, eventually. Truth won, eventually. Heroes get recognized, eventually. That evening, I returned to Hartford Children's Hospital for the first time since being placed on administrative leave. The entire pediatric ward had organized a celebration. Doctors, nurses, and staff members who'd worked with me for years, finally understanding why I'd sometimes seemed distant after difficult shifts, why I'd occasionally startled at sudden noises, why I'd been so uncommonly calm during the most critical emergencies. Dr. Williams found me in the break room afterward. "Rachel, I owe you an apology. When the media attention started, I was worried about protecting the hospital's reputation. I should have been worried about protecting yours." She handed me a letter. "Your job was never in jeopardy, you're one of the best nurses we've ever had. But I want to offer you something more. We're creating a new position, Director of Crisis Response Training. Teaching other medical professionals how to work under extreme conditions, how to maintain composure when everything's falling apart. Interested? I thought about the young nurses I'd worked with, how they'd looked to me during difficult cases, how my experience in Syria had informed every emergency I'd handled since. Teaching those skills, preparing other medical professionals for the worst-case scenarios, felt like a way to honor both my service and my civilian career. Very interested. 6 months later, I stood in my new office at Hartford Children's, looking at the framed Presidential Medal of Freedom hanging beside my nursing certifications. The Crisis Response Training Program had trained over 300 medical professionals. The Veterans Advocacy Foundation I'd started with Jake was helping suppress recognition issues at the systemic level. And Natalie and I were slowly rebuilding a relationship based on honesty rather than hierarchy. My phone rang, displaying a familiar number. Morrison Crisis Response Training, this is Rachel. Ms. Morrison, this is Dr. Amanda Foster from Seattle Children's Hospital. We have a situation here, a natural disaster with multiple casualties, and our staff is overwhelmed. Could you possibly fly out and help coordinate our response? I looked at my calendar, then at the photo on my desk, the original picture from Syria, the one that had started Jake's search. Dr. Foster, I'll be on the next flight. As I packed my emergency medical kit, the same one I'd carried to Syria, I reflected on the journey from that family dinner to this moment. The recognition had been important, the vindication necessary, but the real victory was simpler. I'd learned to value my own worth regardless of whether others saw it. The girl who'd been invisible for 26 years had become a woman who could stand in the light without apology, who could use her voice without shame, who could help others without losing herself. Flying to Seattle to help with another crisis, I realized this was who I'd always been. The ceremony hadn't changed me, it had simply forced the world to catch up to a truth I was finally ready to claim. Some heroes wear medals. Others just show up when they're needed and do the work that saves lives. I was proud to be both. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.